Hi, welcome to New Rome, the show where we discuss the fall of Western civilization and we discuss the various ways humanity is killing itself this week. This is Galahad, this is Percival, I'm Arthur, welcome to the round table. Let's discuss. Hi, welcome back. We have a lot of things that we'd like to discuss on this show. The nature of the self, the fallacies of postmodernism, lots of great political topics, but today we thought we would start something simple, the fall of Western universities. First of all, if you guys are following us at home, we start the beginning of every show with a chocolate, a cheese, and a pop. So for today's cheese, we have a beehive buzzed nat cheese. It's really delicious. And then we have a hazelnut toffee dark chocolate. And then, of course, today we are enjoying a ginger beer. So, gentlemen, let's open up. It's so delicious. Please, everyone, take a chocolate. I'll cut us some cheese. Awesome. Go. Thank you. All right. No problem. Everybody dig in. Personally, I really like this cheese. It's got more of an earthy, it's not bitter. It's almost sweet, but it's definitely very well aged. Yep. I really enjoy it.
I actually think it's quite young.
Really? I mean, obviously, it's not dry enough to have been aged a very long time.
No, I'm thinking this is maybe under a month of aging.
You think so?
Yes. Most definitely. I'm used to cultured sheep and goat milk cheeses, so...
Right, so you're looking at anywhere between 9 and 14 months.
Yeah.
At the minimum for that. What do you think, Galahad?
I'm not a big cheese person myself, but I love it.
What about the chocolate? We've got a hazelnut and toffee dark chocolate. I believe this is 68% cocoa.
I love it. The way that the toffee and the chocolateness swirls together.
This is how every episode is going to begin. You're more than welcome to skip to the point in the video where we begin the actual discussion. But if you're at home following with us and enjoying cheese, chocolate, and a delicious ginger beer, then feel free to just stick with us while we meander about for a second. So you guys pretty excited to talk about the topic today?
That we are.
I can't wait. It's so exciting.
I have an axe to grind with this one.
Oh, with the fall of Westerns, not necessarily the fall of Western civilization, although I could say it begins at the university level.
It begins at the youth, and those foolish youth ends up putting those dumb ideas into practice, which if any one of you guys read, I don't know, any book of the Soviet Union and Stalin, everyone knows how disastrous it becomes.
Right.
You can't just jump to the assumption that the youth are the ones that come up with these ideas.
The Khmer Rouge, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot, which pretty much shot anyone that was educated.
But there are people who instill these ideas in them.
You're right. I'm sorry. I mean those aging Marxist professors which instill the ideas. I'm sorry. I forgot the.
I was going to say we're definitely looking at the death throes of a dying ideology from 100 years ago that is only now under the banner of absolute political ignorance able to take hold in America.
But
it is only because of the miseducation and misinformation of the youth that they are so poorly able to form critical thoughts that you have the acceptance of such an absurd doctrine as Marxism. Only when you have completely thrown out reality and have substituted an egregious fantasy are you even able to begin to accept Marxism as a valid idea.
I believe it goes even beyond that. Well, it starts with the youth. The idea of everyone gets that free little ribbon since they attended that race. Viewpoint, where awarding children for something that they shouldn't be awarded for, attendance.
Right. Well, so thank you so very much, guys, for eating along with us today. So we're going to go ahead and begin the discussion proper now. And again, we like to keep a more loose vibe. These are what are called Friday forums, and it's a roundtable discussion we'll be doing every Friday on the channel here at New Rome. We'll have more professional video essays and things like that. But for right now, we're just starting out with a casual discussion among scholars, seeing what truth we can glean from each other's insights. And you at home, feel free. Think of it as like a visual podcast with food. So, not very serious. However, if you are interested here at New Rome in taking advantage of some of our other videos, particularly the ones that educate you on classical literature, art, philosophy, or the ones on etiquette, you're more than welcome to go and click on those playlists that will be available in the doobly-doo in the description. There will be a link. So, let's go ahead and begin properly then with the discussion. So, the fall of Western universities. So I guess we should probably begin with the formation of Western universities in Europe during the Middle Ages, which are totally different than the agora-style forums of the Roman Empire and, the Greek Athenian democracy. Totally different, much more structured, much more of a heavy emphasis on theological discussion within the very narrow parameters of religious thought, not necessarily a genuine search for truth, but how to get truth to fall within the parameters that you have already outlined within Christian Europe. I think that would probably be a good place for us to begin, at least if we're talking about Western universities.
Well, if you're assuming that universities teach people to confirm their own hypotheses and gravitate toward their biases, I am fully with you in the arts. I mean, there is little argument that some of their better theories are quite short-lived.
Very true. In fact, it's not even until we get to the Enlightenment that we really start to see this strong, skepticism we start to return in a lot of ways to the open-ended ideological thought trains that we see with the Greeks and the Romans, where it becomes less about here's my idea, here's why it's right, and more about I have no idea what I'm talking about. Let's see if we can hash out something that makes sense together through constructive critical thought. So, I guess the real question is, so when do we start to see the decline? Would you gentlemen say that the Enlightenment not only gave us knowledge, but also maybe added an unnecessary level of decadence to the academic sphere? Or do you think that Romanticism is responsible for that? Or maybe you have a third idea?
I would say the Death Note began at Romanticism more towards...
Because personally, I myself am a huge romantic. I absolutely adore Goethe and Shelley. I love young Werther.
Yes,
I mean, I love the Romantic period, especially the Luminism that we start to see in art. When we start to see things like, I wouldn't necessarily call Bierstadt a romantic. He is a Luminist for sure, but we start to see that style of art, and I'm a huge fan of that. I think that's, part of what makes civilization and humanity great, but you may have a point. Percival.
I'd have an entirely different approach. We don't see the fall of the university or the fall of Western civilization or education, for that matter, until you have a reformed education system in the late 1800s under Marxists in the United States that gradually makes its way across Europe as the most educated persons in the world go to American universities at the time, or Oxford, which have already transitioned to being taught in the same manner that grade school is in the United States.
I really think one of the main issues is that when you look at Marx, now, as much as I hate Marxism and communism, as, if you look at him in the same lens as you would Aristotle, where it's like, obviously he's wrong because we have information that proves that he's wrong, but when looking at it in a historical context, where it's like, what can we salvage from this? Because in the end, people that are academic, even if they're totally misguided, usually have something to contribute, and I usually try to look for the silver linings. I guess that's me being romantic and everything. And while Marxism is obviously an egregious breach of human nature, I would say that for the time, at least as a sociological person, I would say that sociology, Marx is fine for the time period, because it's part of that. It's part of the progression of industrial thought, where you start to see how does the world work, how are we looking at the world, and even if he's totally wrong, it's throwing ideas out there, getting the conversation moving. And so one of the reasons I think that Marx's thoughts become so widespread in America at the time is you start to see Marxism at that time explored not as an economic doctrine, not as a political doctrine, because we don't get to that point yet. We don't get to that, we don't get to that solid Marxist, and by the time Marxism, manifests itself as a definitive political ideology that has actual roots of power, we're getting into the Russian Revolution and seeing that these ideas actually used in a statist way. But we see that idea as a sociological theory spread into the United States and take hold with a lot of the, entrenched academics of the time. And I think that's why it becomes so widespread in the United States. because it doesn't get in as a political ideology. It couldn't. It was completely incompatible with the way that the United States ran its government. With the basic spirit of liberty and democracy. But when you look at it when you bring it in as a science, it's a lot easier for it to grow in the minds of the people that it inhabits.
I would like to put an argument that this infection, this fall of the Western universities, might have happened a bit before Marxism in the early 1800s with the idea of the utopianness. You heard about
I was actually just discussing this with Percival the other day. I personally think that utopia is, I wouldn't say, one of the great. It's hard where I'd put it. I would definitely put it on that list of books that did not make the world a better place.
Nope, but it's with these people that derived the idea of to make a better place. This starry-eyed lens.
Because it depends on what you.
That these idealists believe that they can make it good. That's what helped, in my opinion, Marxism with that sociological trend spread further.
Well, because there's a big difference, I feel like, between the religious utopic fantasies where, they abandon materialism and they say, hey, there can be a utopia, but it relies on an existential, ecclesiastical leap of faith where it's like, hey, we can't have perfection, we can't have paradise, but it's a religious idea. It exists inside in your soul. It's an individual thing. Or if we look at things like Hinduism, it's something that you can only achieve in the afterlife by racking up, points for doing what you're supposed to here. But it never, those ideologies, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, never assert that you can use those things to create perfection in the material world. It's purely a spiritual idea, which is why they're not as harmful as something like, let's say, communistic utopic fantasy, where it subverts the very basic idea of human nature and says, no, you can get people to behave this way even if there's no evidence that humanity has ever behaved that way or ever will be capable of behaving that way.
Well, I'd go a step further. I'd say the common critique that it has anything to do with limiting people on their humanity, or to a scale. No, not at all. I'd say it's quite the opposite. It takes for granted resources. The resources are finite. There will always be a higher price paid for something. And I mean, whether that's obtained by preference, whether that's obtained by your government status, or whether that's obtained through,
end of
capital.
The bonnet. I was going to say the end of the bonnet.
I was actually discussing this very thing, except for I was talking about Star Trek. And we were talking about the socialistic aspects of Star Trek, right?
Commie land, you mean?
Well, so here's the thing, right? We were discussing it, and I was reading this. I was being read this article with somebody who made lots of points about how Star Trek, even though it does display all these socialistic tendencies, in many ways does demonstrate that original romantic idea of the heroic individual, which is good and should not be abandoned. But it was also talking about how, essentially it was boiling down to replicator technology and about how there's no scarcity in a replicator technology economy, or that there would be no need. But here's what I was thinking. The way I see it, and obviously Star Trek lore is all over the place and is not consistent or coherent. It's a fantasy like anything else. But the way I would imagine it, because you cannot create or destroy matter, a replicator would simply be rearranging atomic structures in very much the same way that the teleporter would be working on Star Trek. It would basically, at least this is how I imagine it would work. You have a replicator, you need cheese. Well, what is cheese? Well, it's a group of these elements, which are then turned into molecules, which are then turned into proteins, which are then laid out and synthesized into whatever material it is that you're making with the replicator. Those basic fundamental particles would still need to be mined and gathered. If you need silicon for your replicator so that you are able to produce the molecular structures that require silicon, you would need to mine that silicon from a planet or some kind of natural source.
Or you could create it artificially.
You could, but even then that would still take labor. That would still take time.
That would be a lot of labor.
It doesn't... Right. It would make it would make far more sense to go into things like nebulas, or where those elements are there in abundance, being, when we have the death of stars in a supernova...
It would depend on when the technology were created.
That's also
As we are on Earth right now, we can create elements. I mean, the entire principle of nuclear physics and enriching elements is you make them unstable because they are a heavier element and you knock out protons.
but doing that on a scale necessary to create an entire economy based on replication would take
Again, you'd have more machinery.
You would.
You'd literally be able to mine anything from a planet and have machines all over that planet
Right.
designed to literally form.
Exactly, but what I was saying is that would still require a free market to do that. You would need the kind of market structures that Star Trek asserts no longer exist to have those very things come about.
Oh, you need them to have them come about. I don't think anyone, even on the socialist side of economics these days, would assert that a third world country could come to prominence on a global scale without capitalism at first. I mean, there's
Tell that to Venezuela.
there's a reason.
Or any number of the African countries that try to go straight from
Angola,
loose tribal structures to, hey, let's just have a communist utopia.
See, that's the difference, because the entire Western world sees what's wrong with that. Even all of the socialist democracies in Europe come together for the ICCC panels, where they try to push what they can on the International Council on Climate Control, and they decide to pass legislature to redirect money from first world countries to get them to stop polluting the air, to build factories to pollute the air in third world countries, because it's the only way they can compete. They have to be able to take their natural resources and form something else.
Well, that's why China doesn't sign on to any of the world pollution regulations, the mandates.
of course.
Because, I mean,
as much
China-
as I would
they're
love to
crippling
talk
for
about
the economy.
this even more, let's get back to the tax at hand.
Right. The fall of universities.
Universities.
I mean, discussions fluctuate naturally, and that's one of the things that we here on New Rome always want to address. When we do these Friday forums, when we have these discussions are supposed to be organic. And so, one of the reasons we started this channel was because we were under the assertion that while there's a lot of great content out there, especially some great, center-right and libertarian stuff out there, especially on YouTube these days, a lot of it is very heavily scripted, and it's very obvious that, what's the word? I don't think they're having fun.
They aren't. Well,
It's a job.
depending on how much they like to shut down these left-wingers,
Right, it's a job, but it's a job at the end, right? And that's the thing, not everybody is going to go into politics for their job, but everybody can be educated to the point where they can have these kind of discussions at home in a civil manner.
And they should be. I mean, the entire point of having a society where the citizens are active in choosing their government is that the citizens should be active and involved in government.
Which, getting back to the task at hand with the fall of Western universities. So we've got Marxism. We've got Marxism coming into the United States in the 1800s and securing a broad, fan base with higher-end academics in universities, particularly very liberal universities on coastal cities and things like that, New York.
Again, the entire K through 12 education was created, the entire structure, by Marxists.
Right, by what's-his-face. What was his name?
I cannot recall.
Right, famous, but he was a Marxist,
Yeah.
and he was, I can't remember. But yeah, he created the education system as we know it today.
And of course, we go from the traditional structure of universities to the same grading structure, the same lesson structure that we had in those classrooms K through 12, and then we kind of export that around the world. So the fall of these universities, as I was getting to earlier,
Right.
I attribute to that. We have literally created a system where free thought, free discussion, and questioning the lesson plans in general will not get you to where you want to be. No,
Right.
thank you.
Oh, you don't want any more cheese?
Oh, I shouldn't have much to begin with.
Oh, right. Yeah, you're doing your calorie thing.
Yep.
Although, hey, and I feel like though that the fact that this has been happening though has been on a lot of people's radar for a long time, especially when you consider that like one of my favorite things in my library is the Great Books of the Western World series.
Huh.
And at the very beginning of that series, it talks about how the classical liberal education, the education of people through great works from past authors, has all but disappeared by the time it's written in the 50s. And it says that a human being will come closer to being a more educated, enlightened person when they have been able to constructively absorb the past and build on it. Which we'll be talking about the fallacies of postmodern. I don't even necessarily think we'll be able to continue talking about the fall of Western universities without discussing postmodernism and the fact that deconstructionism as an ideology is antithetical to human progression. Because you take a system that nothing is wrong with it. Obviously, it can be improved on because every generation builds upon everyone else's system. Romans build upon the Greeks, Enlightenment philosophers build upon the Romans, and so on and so forth. And industrialization just aids in that fact. But, when you take the entire system and you say this is all worthless or this is all garbage or you write it all off and you try to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel, you end up losing so much of what's fundamentally important to education to begin with. And that's what I think really kills the Western university in the end, is that, they're not reading, they'll read Marx, and they'll read Marx because, he fits into their dogmatic view of the world, and they'll read a couple other authors, but they're not reading, like, Thoreau, they're not reading Shelley, they're not reading Dante, they're not reading, or if you want to get into the science aspect of it, I've taken several science classes at UNLV, and never once did we even crack open The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. That's so fundamentally important to understanding the course of science, because to me, for the same reason I believe that mathematics should be taught as a language, I believe that science should be taught as a history, as well as, because here's the thing, at least in my opinion, you have the analytical sciences, the sciences that rely on pure data and analysis, and in some ways, you can really only discuss, debate, and learn in those subjects by being strictly analytical, and I understand that. There are some fields of science, like Percival over here, who, has his degree in physics.
And mathematics.
And mathematics. When you're learning about physics, it's math.
Yep.
You learn it as a language, here's how you speak it, here's how you use it to understand the universe. And you can use it to broadly, understand a whole range of topics. But learning about it... I'll give you an example. So I was taking a women's study class this last semester, right?
I took one of those many years ago.
So, obviously nowadays you don't really have the option. And they almost make it impossible because they make it worth 3 credit slots. Not just 3 credits, but 3 credit slots. They're saying, hey, you need a class for this subject, and this subject. If you take women's studies, we'll count it for all of them, right? And so they literally offer you, upwards of $1,000 in savings just by taking this dumb class. They're literally paying you off to brainwash you if you really think about it, which I think is disgusting because it's like, oh, how many labs do I have to take? Well, you have to take 2 labs. You have to take 2 labs and 2 science classes as a minimum, right? Mm-hmm. For, I believe, UNLV's basic credit structure. And then depending on what your major is, you might have to take another one. Right? But then they, and you're paying $250 a class for those if you're in state, $450 if you're out of state, and then, they literally come in there and they say, hey, you could spend $750 on taking these 2 separate classes, more if those classes have labs, or you could come in and take women's studies and get all of them knocked out of the park with just one $250 price tag, which for most students is too good of a deal to pass up. It's like, when you don't want to stay in college forever, that's, it gets expensive, even if you have money to throw at it. But my final point that I was getting to was that I didn't learn about a single woman in that entire class.
Let me guess, the patriarchy is what you learned.
I was like, oh great, women's studies. We're going to talk about Mary Anning, or Mary Shelley, or, or Miss Roosevelt, or we're going to talk about, even, getting into some modern contemporaries. We'll talk about Sylvia Plath. We'll talk about Rosa Parks. We'll talk about, I'm fine. There's 1,000,001, great women in history that I would absolutely adore the opportunity to take a real good look at. And it's like, it's women's studies, so, let's dissect the name of that class a little bit, right? Women's studies. I should be studying women in women's studies. But I was not. I was studying sociological Marxism.
I'm sorry. It is women's studies, as in studies for women.
Yep.
Don't you think that women would want to learn about prominent women in history?
Well,
no.
that goes against the narrative. You have to understand one thing. With most of these people, most of these professors, heck, I took a class in anthropology to fill up those 3 critic slots. The first thing that happened was he brought up the Native Americans and the whites. He talks about how how you guys, I should say, Mexican, genocided the whites. The funniest thing is this. He doesn't talk about the Beaver Wars, which pretty much the Iroquois Confederacy, a Native American nation, pretty much tried to decimate.
I'm familiar with the Iroquois
Tried to
Confederacy.
decimate and conquer other territories from other tribes. No, apparently
that's world history.
that is
Every
one.
country that has any land, any group that has any land,
What's
that
your
exists
land will be
in the
my
entire
land.
world was earned through war.
And bloodshed.
Bloodshed.
And
But
conquest.
the problem,
And
though,
conquest.
You know, you can't show me your magical utopia land where you got it because God personally came down and said, "Hi, this is yours," except for maybe in the case of the Jews. And then it's like, well, you still have to fight for it back in the end.
Yeah.
So, it sucks to be you.
And we didn't even end up winning it. The Brits did, and then they decided to create a mandate, and then everyone got pissed at them
Exactly.
because they did what they
Sykes
wanted
Pico.
to with their territory.
I saw this hilarious picture the other day on Facebook. It was a picture of this this Orthodox Jew, and it was basically like and then the other one was like of a Sitting Bull or something. And the picture of Sitting Bull, he was saying something along the lines of they stole our land, and the one with the Orthodox Jew was saying, "Then steal it back, you pansy."
But we,
And
they
yeah,
did
the
fight
Jews
back.
didn't. The Jews really didn't.
Let-
I mean, when it comes down to it,
let-
Britain gained it through war. They decided to issue a mandate. It was given to Jews to create Israel and to Arabs to create Jordan.
Or slash Palestine, if you want to
Oh,
go
no,
on
no,
that
no.
thing.
No, Jordan. Literally.
Then,
not a
Then
I
the
mean,
whole-
don't forget, anyone who says they are a refugee and
Is
claims
a
to be
liar.
Palestinian
is Jordanian.
should have been in Jordan. That's the thing. They went to war as soon as Israel was created,
right.
using all of the weapons of mass
We should
injury.
stop right here for that. Not because I don't enjoy talking about the
Right.
subject, but we'll actually be covering Israel in a future Friday forum.
World War III, Israel.
So if we go back to Western universities
Mhm.
and the settings,
The
Right.
problem with Western universities, most of Western education, is that they're easy to pretty much believe what the teacher says, parrot what the teacher says, and believe it as the truth. So
Well-
by the time you get to university and you see these professors that complain about conservatism, the patriarchy, whatever
Yeah.
it is, of cultural Marxism, you have to take. You're pretty much programmed towards to believing that it's true.
I mean, as I said, if you question the teachers, if you question the assignments in order to, better facilitate your own learning, you do not pass courses, which is a serious issue.
That is, because you're not
Because
gauging people on their critical analysis, you're gauging people on their retentiveness of your particular ideology. Which is horrendous, because at that point, you're literally just an Orwellian indoctrination camp. You're not even really an institution of higher learning.
Hey, we don't want the party to know that we're against them.
Right, exactly. Big Brother is always watching, right?
Well, we would see increases in ACT and SAT scores if people were being taught to critically think. Instead, we're seeing the entire opposite.
Right, that
I
makes
mean-
sense.
SAT scores, ACT scores, highly correlated to IQ. If you look at IQ, it's fostered during your formational years, during your youth, and to those who don't have it fostered, who don't have good families, don't have good environments for it, they aren't getting that stimulation in school. They aren't bettering their knowledge.
Well, I mean, because I think a large part of it is, and this is, again, just my personal opinion, but for me, education is something that has to be established young. You have to have a love for learning, or be taught to have a love for learning early on. It is very rarely something, because even people that grow up in disparate situations who end up pulling themselves out of it usually report being extremely curious as children and having an innate desire. And there is something to be said, I feel like, even though this might come as a bit of a work to people who are all about the unstoppable will of the individual. But in some ways, you could make the argument that some people just are more innately predispositioned to, being interested in self-educating. I mean, we have people who grow up in very similar environments, with very similar stimuli, who are completely neglected, not giving opportunities to education, and yet some choose to, improve themselves and progress, and others do not.
That's the number one argument that exists at the moment as to why income inequality is the dumbest subject and dumbest problem in world history to ever exist.
There will always
You
be
believe that there
income.
can be a third party who steps in and makes people more equal and gives them more equal footing than two people growing up in the same household, with the same parents, the same resources, and turning out differently.
Income inequality. Oh God! If I could tell about one thing about that, it's
Equality
funny.
of opportunity is
I'm-
not
Equality
I'm-
of outcome.
Exactly.
To quote,
Anyone.
anyone. I was thinking Jordan Peterson.
No, this has been said for the last 200 years.
That's true, but I was just recently watching one of his videos. You were saying, Galahad?
With this idea of equality of opportunity and this equality of outcome, for many professors, they always teach me one thing. For some reason, because I'm a first-generation immigrant, because I'm Mexican, I'm oppressed. I always look at them and say, you're quite wrong. I live in an upper middle class household. My parents pretty much buy my education. I pretty much rely on my parents. I'm pretty much a stereotypical college student that is completely privileged. You know what differentiates me from, I don't know, some homeless guy out in the street? My parents came here with nothing, and instead of using that as an excuse to do nothing, they pretty much decided to say, I'm going to make what's best of it and work hard to get my money, to work hard to rise above. They even taught me one thing. Nothing's going to be handed to me. I have to work hard for it if I really want it.
Well, I mean, that's
And-
generally the attitude among a lot of the first-generation immigrants who come to the country.
It is. I mean, first-generation immigrants who come here legally do quite well. It's
The problem, though, is this, though. Is that with this education system that teaches kids that they're special just for existing, the viewpoint that's saying, no matter what, everything's gonna work out fine.
Wait, did you say I didn't win a trophy? I'm calling my mom.
The problem with that is...
call your mom, go cry about it.
The
Get it
problem-
out of your system. Grow. Take this as an opportunity.
The problem with this is that we're not, in university, they're supposed to teach you, prepare you for life. They're not preparing you for life.
I would
They're
actually,
preparing you for failure.
finally, something we disagree on. So I would actually argue that the point of education, of the educational system, is not to teach you how to succeed in life. I personally feel like it is the mandated responsibility of people who reproduce to give their children the tools necessary to succeed. For me, academia is purely a refining of talents already cultivated in the home. To me, at least. It's like, you might not learn how to be Mozart at home, but you will learn how to play chopsticks. You might not know about Thoreau at home, but you will learn to love to read at home. You might not learn about Dante, you might not learn about Christ. You might not even be a very formed individual when you step out of the door and into college. But at least you have the very basic aspects of humanity instilled in you. As a teacher myself, I find it absolutely deplorable that I have to teach basic humanity to teenagers. It's like, look, and this is just my opinion, you're more than welcome to jump in after I say this. If you are going to reproduce, and this is where I get a little bit weird. If you are going to reproduce, if you are going to make a child, if you are going to spread your genetics, heaven forbid, and make the planet filled with more of you, you better make sure that you are not creating a deficit. You are creating a positive. And this is my last statement on the issue, and then you can interject. I personally believe that there are only two ways to righteously raise a child. Righteous way number one. You are uneducated, but you value education and you know that it's important, so you entrust the education of your children from an early age to people who can educate them. Righteous way number two. You yourself are educated and you have taken up the mantle that you already know that you should have, and you have decided to personally see to the betterment and education of your child. And now you may interject.
Well, I'd say on that second point, we have very few individuals that do so. And the failure of American colleges and the entire university
academia.
system worldwide, is largely due to the fact that these kids don't know what an education should look like. So even if they go into a classroom and these professors are telling them things that literally just confirm their biases,
You're special.
have huge fallacies built into them.
It's not your fault that you're suddenly poor, oppressed, and all this stuff. It's the patriarchy. It's the white cis male.
Well, if you look at the entire doctrine of privilege, if we define privilege under law, it is having a right that is legally defined that others do not, or that is granted to you in particular, which is something that Caucasians, that males, do not have. There are protections for other groups. There are affirmative action programs for minorities. The one thing that white males do not have is privilege under law. The privilege that they suppose exists, they derive from the God of the Gaps fallacy, because they consider the variables that they think are important.
Right.
And then they
without
ignore
addressing
the
everything
others.
else. Yeah, exactly.
They don't allow for other variables until someone else comes along and finds them. They say there's a 77% gap. Well, no, there's a 77-cent earning for women to every dollar a man makes.
Right, but then they don't...
As soon as you plug in the variables, it turns out women make more as long as they've been working for equal time periods with equal, credentials.
Right, and they're working the same job. And there's as many of them involved in that career. I mean, we'll talk about the wage gap later, just because, needless to say, it can pretty much just be explained by the fact that, hey, there aren't a ton of women in nuclear engineering. Sorry. So obviously men are going to make more in that field because there's more of them.
No. In fact, women are more likely to make more in that field.
I'm just saying that there's less of them, so when averaged out overall...
the women are still making more in that field, because your few women in that field are making lots of money.
Right.
They're in demand, they're promoted more easily, women in STEM fields get hired more often than men do due to discrimination in hiring practices.
You mean affirmative action? Let's face it. Though, one of the things I actually had to argue with one of my fellow students is the idea of affirmative action. I asked him simply this. So you have two people, they're equally qualified, just one's a minority, the other one's not a minority. Who are you gonna choose? They pretty much is the one that's least representative, the minority. So this guy gets screwed out of a job. Congratulations, you discriminated this guy based on race.
Well, if it comes down to personal choice, discrimination is a great tenet. Discrimination is something that every single person should use every single day of their life in every decision they make.
Right.
I mean, we discriminate.
Right.
At this table, we look at this table, we say, hey, I like chocolate. I like cheese. I like ginger beer. I think I'd like to partake of them. I am not a huge fan of watered-down Coke. No one likes their ice melting in their Coke.
Right.
Or at least not normal people. I mean,
that's why if you do put ice in your soda, the soda should already be cold.
I mean, when the incel revolution comes about in a few years, the entire talking point, as made by these American universities, these global universities at this time, is that discrimination should not be allowed. And so, you can't discriminate in who you'd like to sleep with. You can't discriminate in favor of your own wife over other wives. You can't discriminate in terms of your children. I'd like to take care of my children. Too bad. You should give to all children equally. I'd like to just sleep with my girlfriend. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't do that. You should have sex with anyone who asks for it. Why do you get to discriminate?
Oh gosh, that's
so
terrible.
The entire legal precedent is that the government should not discriminate in the services that it provides, because the entire service that a government should provide is protecting your rights.
True, but...
You shouldn't lose your rights to the government deciding you can't have these rights.
True.
Alright. And I think that's what we're going to go ahead and end the discussion for today. Thank you guys so very much for joining us here on our Friday forum for our roundtable discussion. It's been a pleasure. And again, this is Galahad. This is Percival. I'm Arthur. And thank you for joining us at the roundtable. We'll see you next week, where we'll actually be talking about another hilarious topic that we here on the show are pretty big fans of: cultural relativism. Catch you later.
Saudi Arabia. That's all I need to say. Saudi Arabia.
Play out credits. Spay and neuter your pets.
Okay.